Good evening, welcome back to the Horror Video Games. Today I'm talking about the perception that Bioshock is a horror game. Now, if we look at the horrific elements within Bioshock, you may be fooled into thinking, yes, perhaps it is a horror game. So we have the psychotic surgeon, we have the murdering of the children, we have the drug-addicted splicers, we have the assembling of the masterpiece, and the hanging corpses. By all accounts, you would think that this was actually a horror game. But then the question is, what is a horror game? What makes a horror game? And is this actually an important question? There are many great horror games I could use for comparison purposes in this argument, so for argument's sake I will say Silent Hill 2. So let's think about the similarities between the two games. So there are horrific elements, there's a good storyline, there's an original game world, and there are deep characters. Now, probably the big difference between Bioshock and Silent Hill 2 is that Bioshock doesn't induce fear. This leads to another interesting question: is it necessary for a horror game to induce fear? Are there any other alternatives to this? So I think it's a problematic way of defining horror by saying, oh, if it's scary it must be horror, because I'm sure there are many different ways of horrifying the audience without it actually being scary in the first place, as in darkness and zombies and ghosts and these kinds of things. So I think we have to look more into what makes a horror game, which is beyond just being scary. So let's talk about why Silent Hill 2 is such a successful horror game. It has a greater perversion of the game world, not only visually but in behaviour as well, in terms of these strange characters and this sense of disturbance, this disorder, this sense of the unnatural, and the feeling that there is something terribly spiritually and emotionally wrong with the place that you're exploring. The world itself represents trauma. The game is a metaphor for James's guilt. Then we have the orgy with Pyramid Head, we have the grotesqueness, and also the game goes further in dehumanizing the human form, and also finally the dedicated scene of tragedy. The use of subtlety and metaphorical imagery and the feeling of transience and the unreal makes Silent Hill 2 a triumph in horror games. In the game of Bioshock, we see these terrible events happening in the world of Rapture, but the player has no emotional connection to these characters. These horrific scenes have no deeper emotional impact on the player. And I think the horrors of Bioshock apply more to the protagonist's situation rather than the experiences of other people. For me, horror is about witnessing the suffering of others and being powerless to stop it. Now, of course the world of Rapture has suffered, but it happened long in the past, whereas I feel horror games which are more successful focus on suffering which happens in the present tense, or very close to the present, and maybe you've just missed it, or these kinds of things. But then you could say, yes, the tragedy in Silent Hill 2 happened ages ago, but then again James is suffering in the present, so his sense of guilt, his trauma, he feels that throughout the entirety of the game. So it feels like that suffering towards his wife, his feelings towards his wife, is a constant throughout the whole game. So that tragedy seems to almost remain in the present for the whole game. Whereas the world of Rapture, all of that had happened before the player had entered into the game world. So you're seeing the kind of aftermath of that terrible event, whereas in the experience with James, you are experiencing this right now, as in you're going through his guilt right now in the present tense. So I think that's why it's more successful and more meaningful and more profound than Bioshock. Rather than coming into a world which is already devastated, you come into the mental, emotional world of an already devastated character. Great horror elements, I feel, have to be inflicted onto others that we care for, and seeing the effect of this physical and emotional pain is extremely powerful in video games. There are no individual characters in Bioshock which you really feel emotionally connected to, and so when events happen in the game, you don't really care that much. And I think the trademarks of horror is you see your friends dying, you see your family members dying, and you can't do anything about it, and you see their suffering, and you see the immediacy of people suffering in the present tense. And I think it kind of, I mean, with the example of Fatal Frame, you can't help these ghosts, you can't help these dead family members who have been sacrificed. Despite these events happening in the past, their suffering continues in the present, which I think is one of the most important elements of horror games. And I think the greatest horror games do this. They present suffering in the present tense of other people you are connected to, and I think this is just absent from Bioshock. And I feel using the label of a horror game in the context of Bioshock is misplaced. So those are some of my thoughts on this subject. So I'm very curious to know what everyone else thinks of this. Do you agree or disagree? So I could have literally picked any great horror game to form a comparison with Bioshock, and I think every time I see Bioshock labelled as a horror game, I think this is a mistake, honestly. I think although Bioshock has horrific elements to it, that doesn't necessarily make it a horror game. So I feel like I want to explore the theme of the definition of a horror game a bit more in future videos, and what does it mean to categorize things? What does that mean? What's the value of doing that? And so please let me know what you think in the comments. Please leave me some feedback. Don't forget to comment, rate, and subscribe. You can tweet me at thehorrorofvg. This is The Horror of Video Games, and I'll see you next time.